understand, with no meaning, is no more a writing. So before we started our very interesting digression on paradigm, etc., I think we were just trying to see how the illocutionary act, the commandment, the oath, etc., grounds the semantic relation itself. So that the link between words and things is grounds on this act of language, this illocutionary act like commandment, oath, as if here the original commanded is the one addressed to the word so that they refer to things. Because I hope it's evident for you that no one never could really understood how is that word referred to things. It's really a huge problem that of course cannot be explained by the naive theory that men agreed to use this for this, because how could they agree if they didn't have the language? So it's not an evident problem at all. How does a word refer to a thing? This is a kind of a huge problem. And here we see that in some way it is an act of commandment, an act of commandment or an oath who tries to establish and fix this relationship. And we could, in this perspective, see in a new light this concept we tried to speak about yesterday of the 0 degree. 0 degree. You remember, for instance, Lévi-Strauss' conception that a 0 degree signifier is a signifier without any signified, an exceeding signifier to which no signification, no signified corresponds. And perhaps this notion of a 0 degree covers what we're trying to understand. The 0 degree perhaps covers this aspect of commandment implicit in language. Because if we ask now, how can we conceive a 0 signifier, a signifier which without a signified. A signifier without a signifier is not a sign, is an act, is an action. So the 0 degree is a way to keep, to maintain the signification even where there is no more signification. Because with this idea of a 0 signifier, we still believe that there is a signifier without signification. What is a signifier without signification? It's still a sign, or is something else, an act. Like we remember when the discussion between Benjamin and Scholem said in Kafka novels we have a 0 degree of Torah, 0 degree of revelation. The revelation in its null punct. But then Benjamin objected, no, a revelation, a writing which you cannot understand, no meaning, is no more a writing, it is life. In the same way, we could say a signifier without signifier, it's not a sign, it's an act, it's an action. We could say, we'll speak about this, it's a gesture. And then, so in some way, all these zero-degree theories that we examined in Derrida deconstruction, the linguist's conception of a zero-degree. Yes?
When you say Derrida, we spoke in another seminar about hospitality, and Derrida's conception of hospitality, inviting someone in without asking any questions as a gesture, but it seems to me that that's also a naming, or a kind of a reconstructing, a renaming. So there is a semantic, linguistic element to it. So we can speak about this as the zero-degree signifier, but there's also always this kind of second-level aspect involved. I don't know.
Yeah, in some way we could see that Derrida deconstruction implies always this dimension of a zero signification. There is signification, you're right, there is, but without content, without, of course, the main point for deconstruction, signification must be this, even it's in its zero-degree form. Then we could say that this paradigm of the zero-degree signification covers the phenomenon we are trying to understand here, this fact that here we have something exceeding signification, which is no more signification, which is an act, which is a commandment, which is a gesture. We have something else. If we keep the paradigm of signification at that stage, we lose the perception of the difference that is implied in the phenomenon. So I think that the zero-degree theory, of course, was very useful in human science in the 20th century. It permitted the constitution of many disciplines, especially in the linguistics domain. But then also it covered the possibility of seeing that there is something else. There is a commandment, there is an act, there is something which is not of the order of signification. What I reproach to this theory is that they understand signification as never ending. There is no limit to signification. There always will be signification. You will have signs even where no signs, no signified is there. So it's kind of a primacy of the signification in the 20th century culture. You could say that the 20th century culture is under this paradigm of signification at any price. Signification must be there even where nothing is signified. But in that way, many political aspects, this phenomenon, for instance, of an heterogeneous phenomenon appearing in linguistics, appearing beyond signification, like the commandment we are trying to understand, is something which exceeds signification. Commandment is not a sign, it's not an act of signification. And this could be perhaps the moment of speaking of a very interesting problem, which is the problem of gesture. Because, as you know, commandment can take the form of a gesture. Yeah? Gesture of commandment. The gesture is a very interesting phenomenon. We have very few investigation in that very interesting field. But for instance, we have some investigation on the gesture that accompanies a language. You know, I'm gesticulating while speaking. So this kind of gesture, called by the German scholars Redegestus, gesture of language, of speaking. And So we have some interesting investigation on this gesture, which accompany the act of speaking. In our perspective, it would be interesting to understand, are they emphasizing the illocutionary aspect of language? Probably. The kind of gesture are an illocutionary element. Making a gesture, I am trying to displace language discourse on a plan of act, as an action, and translating an action my speech, and this is probably on this side, it's kind of an illocutionary, non-linguistic element, but which always accompanies language. And then we have very interesting works on this. You know that Neapolitan peoples are famous for their power of gesticulating. So we have a very beautiful book written by a strange, curious, not really a scholar, but a kind of a strange man in the 18th century. His name was De Iorio, and he wrote a book on the gesticulation of Neapolitans as a key to understand the gesture of the ancients. Why the gesture of the ancients? Because we have statues. The Greek and Roman statues always have a gesture. We have also some paintings with gesture. And he had the idea that through the gesticulation of Neapolitan people, we could understand the meaning of this gesture. So it's not bad. It's an interesting book, and it's now very fashionable between anthropologists.
What's the author's name? I'm sorry.
The name is theater is something as the gesture of ancients interpreted through the gesture of Neapolitan people, something like that in Italian. It is translated in English. So then we also know through the rhetoric treatises of Latin and Greeks that a Greek or Latin Roman orator had to use gesture. And the ability to use gesture was part of the art of speech. So we have description of this gesture, which are redeges, so the gesture of speaking, and we know we have many instances of this gesture. And then we have also representation. So we have images which represent an orator by speaking. Then we have, so first problem, what is the status of this curious language gesture, which accompany language, It would be interesting to understand, do they work emphasizing or underlining the non-apophantic aspect of the language? Could be like this, but this is also an interesting field. Why do we make gesture while we speak? And probably, if we were, for instance, we could imagine that an absolutely serious scientist would make no gesture because it is only in the cognitive and apophantic plan. So if you make a gesture, you exceed this plan. But on the contrary, continuously people make gesture.
My wife is a neuroscientist, and they teach her when she makes presentations
not to make
still,
gesture.
because people don't want to see you doing this. They won't take you seriously, she says.
Yeah, it has been, there were some correlations found between doing this and exercising in real time. Parts of the brain. Exercising, literally having a physical impact on parts of your brain that are being connected. So you do this also to help yourself.
It can have many causes. But then just ask the question: how can we understand them in relation of ourselves? Which part they are situated, which part they can fit. But then we have also, on the contrary, we know also from also the documents, ancient documents, that there existed gesture of commandment. Precisely gesture of commandment. We have representation of the Roman emperor making a gesture of commandment, which is often the right arm raised with the hand raised like that. It is the one the fascists took. This was meant as a gesture of commandment, and there were even commentaries by ancient historians, for instance, say the emperor making this gesture stop the barbarian armies. It was a gesture, an efficacious gesture of commandment. So these are not very interesting for us, because they are a commandment which, instead of taking the form of a linguistic form, takes another form which was parallel to the other, because the putting together gesture and language is part of the rhetoric tradition of the Western culture. There you have a gesture which autonomizes itself and stays alone as gesture of commandment. Then we have also other similar, that's a very curious thing, that from this gesture of commandment and from the gesture also of the rhetorician, which were similar, because sometimes the rhetorician had to raise the arm and staying, for instance, like this, like that, etc. And then we had also the interesting fact that this gesture was retaken and articulated in a different way in the Christian gesture of benediction. You see benediction? Mm-hmm. So the Christ is often represented in the gesture of what is called Latin benediction. And we have two forms. Now I forgot exactly. One is like this, the other is a different way of putting the fingers, but it is a gesture of benediction, which had a huge importance in not only in the representation of the Christ, but then after in the liturgy, because then the Pope will repeat this gesture of benediction, and the Bishop will repeat this gesture of benediction, etc. Mind the term benediction. Contains the verb dicere. Diction means telling the word, saying the word. And the contrary is the curse, is a malediction, saying the evil. Saying the evil. It's an interesting fact that, for instance, we didn't mention this, that in the formula of the ancient oath, often the formula was contained a malediction. So there is I swear this and this, but then there was a curse, a malediction, saying, if I do not do this, my sons will be killed, my house will be destroyed, and that some kind of a curse accompanied the oath. And we did not speak about this. Of course, the curse and the benediction are non-apophantic form of logos. Of course, the curse cannot be true or false, and the benediction cannot be true or false. So it's another instance of non-apophantic logos. And another example we did not mention is the blasphemy. You say blasphemy? Mm-hmm. Blasphemy. Blasphemy is not true or false. I am not familiar with the English blasphemy, which would be a very normal form of English blasphemy. I know the French, the Italian, there are a lot of them, there are thousands of forms of blasphemy. How would be a current, Goddamn? Or Jesus Christ, because pay attention. The blasphemy in the beginning is not accompanied like God damned God. No, the blasphemy in the beginning is just the pronunciation of the name of God in vain. No, because the oath contained the name of the God. But this was legitimate. The God was called as witness. But if you take the name of God from the oath, you take apart from it, you have a blasphemy. And what in the commandments is, do not use the name of God in vain. So the blasphemy had the form of just, Jesus Christ is a blasphemy. Jesus, not English. What another form of English blasphemy? You're not familiar, you never pronounce it. That's the decay of religion in the English world.
In English, they say bloody. Bloody. But it means by the lady, meaning Mary. So bloody, which you often hear, bloody means
Mary.
by the lady. The lady, the Virgin Mother. Bloody.
Okay. So, it's evident that this, the curse and the blasphemy are form of non-apophantic logos. We didn't analyze them, but it would be interesting. And also the insult is a form of non-apophantic logos. If you say you asshole, of course, it's not true, you're not an asshole. Or, I don't know, the insult, by definition, cannot be considered as true or false, because otherwise it will be not offend. If someone tells me, insults me, and I consider it as an apophantic logos, I'm not offended, because I just to say, no, sir, you are mistaken. I'm not but on the contrary, no, that's important, because it's not evident that the insult is not a judgment. When I insult a man, I'm not saying you belong to the category asshole, or you belong to the category pig, or whatever. I don't know which are the insult. Because if you read like that, it's not an insult, it's just a statement, but it is a false statement. Technically. But the semantic of insult is non-apophantic. So just to see how big is the field of the non-apophantic. But let's speak a moment on still on the concept of gesture. Because also we saw this gesture, commandment gesture which accompany discourse. But let's try to, and when we go back to something we saw with the example, and also when you made you mentioned the mimicry. So let's try to understand what a pure gesture could be. I take this term pure gesture from Benjamin, who speaks of, in a different context, of a reine Mittel, of a pure medium. So, what could we define as being really a pure gesture? So, if I move my arm, my hand, in order to take this glass, in order to drink, we can call this a gesture, but that's not exact. This is just a movement of my hands from. I'm displacing my hand from this point to the other in order to do a thing. So there is a clear end. But what would it be? A pure gesture. So now think to a mime. You say mime in English? Mm-hmm. Making this same gesture. Same gesture I've done now, made by a mime. So no glass, of course, no drinking, no water. What happens when a mime makes a gesture? Could you try to define this, what happens here? So, the first example is clear. I move my hand, and I want to drink, so there is a clear hand, and I drink, I take the glass and drink. But when a mime makes the same gesture or another gesture, what is he doing? He's doing the same gesture in some way, but deprived from any connection to the end. But I say this, it's deprived of any connection. Is this true? Now, in some way, he is repeating the gesture of drinking. What happens here is that the gesture is shown in its as being a medium, a mean toward the end of drinking, but deprived to its connection to the end. So it is, as we said, that the example shows, and when I make an example, the singularity shows its belonging to the set. In the same way, in the gesture of the mime, the movement of my hand is shown in its nature of being a mean towards an end, but now the relationship to the end is cut. And so we perceive, we could say, what the mime shows is the gesture, the pure gesture in itself. But it's still the same gesture, it's not another gesture. It's the same gesture of drinking, shown as a means to the act of drinking, but freed from the relation to the end. Yes?
But could we say that the act of illustration is the end?
The act of?
Illustration, because the mind engages in mimesis, which is imitation or illustration. So is the end result the actual illustration, the process of illustrating the gesture? Could that be the actual goal?
Yeah, you are trying to restate the absence of an end as being the end. I don't think it's like that. So the end of the mime, it's not so simple as I'm making the gesture of drinking. No, it would be not interesting. It shows the gesture in its pure nature of gesture, no? Without the connection to an end, but without establishing a new connection. This is our aesthetical perception that makes us think also that the end now is just illustrating. I don't think it's true. It's our aesthetic perspective that makes us assign a new end. There is no end. What is shown is the gesture as, using Benjamin's word, as reine Mittel, as pure means, without an end. But it's not another thing. So it's not that it is still. I mean, he's still making the gesture of drinking. And you recognize it as such. You recognize that it is the gesture of drinking. So it is still a mean toward an end, but freed by the relation to a mean. So shown as such.
Is the relation then to the example, the singularity?
Yeah, when I got this idea when you were speaking of the example and spoke that made me cry, because also the example shows its belonging to something, but not in the same way. It's extracted from this relation. So in some way, the gesture of the mime shows the gesture of drinking, but freed from the relation to. But we really perceive, we could see now for the first time, I see what is the gesture of drinking. Because in the normal gesture of drinking, you don't see the gesture. So the gesture as a pure means gets forgotten in the usual gesture. So it's no more. That's why I say the real gesture is the one of the mind, not the one I'm doing. But this is true for a huge lot of dance, I mean, can be understood in that perspective. What a good definition of dance could be. Dance shows the movements of the bodies as pure means, as pure gesture. But you have just yes?
But not necessarily in relation to a.
No, the mime, there is a relation to an end, but then there you have the possibility of movements of a human body shown with no relation to an end. The dancer will show the movement of the body, but again, as such, free of any relation to this particular. So the dancer does not move in order to go from the point A to the point B because there is something, there is certain reason. There is no reason to move from one point to the other. But in that way, the human body is, the possibility of movement is human body is shown as such. But there is nothing transcendent, there is not another dimension. It's just the dimension of the possibility of movements of the human body. It's exactly like in the mime. There is nothing, there is not another dimension. It is the same gesture of drinking which is shown as such, not the context in which it goes. And this is, so I think it's a very important concept in to better understand what is called aesthetics, a word which I do not like at all, aesthetics. But I mean, all the domain of art has to do with this dimension of pure means, or gesture as such. Not as a, in some way we could even... Pure means. Means? Why say pure means? Because it is still a means. Because it's making the same gesture, which is a mean towards the end of drinking. But shown as such, free to the relation of the. So strangely, yes, it still means it's not another. It's not another dimension. It's not. It's because usually aesthetic is defined as the dimension of the end in itself, in themselves, as a pure end. No, it's not a good concept. The aesthetics is not the dimension of the end in itself. It is a dimension of pure me, without an end. And for instance, we could look to poetry also in this same direction, the same perspective. Because what is a poem? A poem does not transcend the plane of language. A poem is something which is totally on the plane of language. It would be stupid to think that poetry goes beyond. No, poetry stays on the level of language, the language we use. But then what happens is perhaps that for the first time language is shown as such. Not used to an end of communication, information. So what happens in the poem is that language, all these functions of communication, information, etc., are deactivated, and language is shown as such, as pure means. I say pure means because there is not another. It's not that now I transfer language in the heaven. Not at all. It's just stays in the level of language. It's simply using language, but what you get is that all these other functions, which usually we consider as fundamental, communication, information, etc., the normal semantic content of the language, is made inoperative, so that language is shown as such and open to a new possible usage.
And even when we have an extreme case, for example, of mnemologics, where you have mnemologics, even where you have a word, for example, that speaks, that will give a sentence in English or French or a simple song. It is a kind of within a kind of paradigmatic set of relations. It appears as language, but its very appearance is as language without reciprocity, meaning that it cannot go back to a communication. It cannot even go back to the human because it is, after all, a bird. Nonetheless, even in that appearance, it is a mark for the pure language, rather, even in such an extreme case.
I never thought of it, but it's right.
I think
The only problem is that in my life I had a very strange experience with her, which really marked my difficulty that I go back to this. So in Rome there was a restaurant where there was these black Indian birds that are called Garrula religiosa. Okay? There's a bird who speaks perfectly.
in English it's called Maina.
So they speak really perfect. And not only speak, but they can imitate the calf or a dog. But so this bird was there in the entrance of the restaurant, but he always repeated the same thing. Ciao, come stai? Ciao, how are you? Ciao, come stai? Ciao. So once, I used to go very often to this restaurant. So once, just getting out from the restaurant, he was there, he told me, ciao, come stai? And I said to him, dici sempre le stesse, you repeat always the same thing. And he told me, you too. You laugh, but for me it was Can you imagine? As you told, you can imagine the reciprocity. In that case, I was really struck. Then perhaps a possible explanation is that it was, he learned to say this, and then if someone said something else, perhaps someone struck the input. I don't know, but it was really sad because it just said, you too.
But you know, wherever it comes from, when it returns like that, it's absolutely terrifying because it's completely uncanny and terrifying, and it's like an echo. It comes back from where? What is it? It's uncanny.
But if you now go back to our idea of the poem, this seems really to me a good definition of what happens in a poem. It stays on the level of language, it does not transcend it. But in disactivating all this information, the usual function of language, we can say it shows language as such, freed from any other function, and this opens the possibility of a new usage that we call the poem. We call this poem, poetry, which is not useless. It's yes.
You earlier had talked about the naked semantic core of the verb and not the imperative voices. And I'm wondering if there's a relationship with gesture, and as you described the gesture of the mind as being a kind of naked semantic core.
Yeah, probably you're right, because I mentioned this because it was this Benveniste definition of the imperative, very quick definition, very contradictory. He said, you in the imperative you have the naked semantic core, but with no denotation. So in this way it could be, yes, you have the language as such without any reference to communicative or informational or even semantic. But he said semantic core, strange, contradictory. No? Yeah, but in a way, the poem continues to mean. It's not meaningless. But in some way, it achieves to show itself, language itself as such. This makes it's kind of surprising thing. So when you read a good poem, there is a moment of surprise because you perceive language as such, not described in all its informational function, etc. And this, it's also a new possibility of usage. Because when you, that's why I say that the mime, it's repeating the same gesture, but it's something new. It's also something new. Not transcendent, it stays on the same level, but it's something new. It's a new usage of gesture, which shows gesture as such, and the dancer also cares for it. And perhaps you could extend this to painting, I don't know, with image, as if the painter shows the vision, for the first time, the vision as such. You always are looking at things, you're looking at things, you're accustomed to look at, to see things. Perhaps now, look at that. The painter shows something, look at that, and you discover the vision, you discover vision as such, perhaps. I don't know.
Just to talk about the art function maybe in front of the viewer, the art critic Boris Royce says, the art critic Boris Royce.
I know.
Yeah, he says that we need criticism as a textual bikini to cover the nakedness of art between ourselves and the art.
Repeat it.
So we need criticism as a kind of textual bikini to cover the nakedness of the encounter with art. So he says we need that sort of mediating process in order to experience art. Otherwise, it's too naked. Yeah.
There is also a definition made by a strange guy, a kind of artist. I always quote it, and it says, art is a way to make life more interesting than art.
It's Robert Friedman.
Interesting guy. He also said another nice thing. He said, a bird is a bird. A bourgeois is a bourgeois. A bird eaten by a bourgeois is a meal. A bourgeois eaten by a bird is a miracle. I always forget its name. Yes.
I have just one small reference on the language that Thomas was using of the terrifying, of the horrifying encounter in relation to the mimetic arts. I mean, I think that this is the perfect entree to return back to the precise language that Plato uses in the Greek for justification of the notion of banishing the mimetic arts from the polis, and that is because of its potentiality to inspire a theos phobos, a divine fear, a divine awe, which is the awe of seeing the artifice which the art is exposing in the encounter with a pure means. So just on the textual level, it's precisely the terror. Precisely the horror.
When confronted with this, you can feel terror, you can feel joy, you can feel astonished, amazed, but you have a reaction. If it really works, if it really shows language as such, shows gesture as such, you're struck. It's impossible not to be struck because it frees what you do every day we speak, every day we speak, every day we move. But then for the first time we perceive language and movement as such.
Which is to perceive that it is possible to do this otherwise. I mean, this is why it's threatening to the polis.
Yeah, and yeah, also that's why it opens up to a new usage. It's important because it's not gratuitous. The showing language as such means also to make a new usage possible. So it's not simply negative. Just showing. It's not just showing language as such, but doing this makes possible another usage of language. I just say, so I could use language in that way, and then invent even a new way. So the point is not repeating the same thing. Okay, why we came to this? And then again, this why I mention this also? It has to do with our subject, because this notion of reine Mittel, pure mean, is, in my opinion, beyond the opposition of apophantic and non-apophantic logics. It seems to be on the side of the non-apophantic, because it's kind of an action that you act on language, you act on gesture. But what you have, in my opinion, is beyond this opposition, this machine, double machine, commandment, apophantic logos, etc. No? So the two, we have a kind of third in this dimension of pure means. You cannot say this is simply a speech act. It's more than that. The art is not, the poet is not making simply a speech act. And it's not simply locutionary, because it's not the semantic which is important. So it seems to me that it could be a third that we could point as being a possibility of thinking in another way the linguistic machine, another way to disactivate both aspects, both the apophantic and the non-apophantic, and opening a new perspective, which we can call pure means, just to use Benjamin. Very beautiful formulation. By the way, Benjamin speaks of this notion of reine Mittel, pure means, in the political dimension. It is in his beautiful essay on violence. In 1921 he wrote a very beautiful essay on violence, and there he develops this idea of a political action conceived as pure means, without an end. Freed from the mean, but emancipated from the relation to end. So he employs this dimension in this concept in politics, but we can, I think, generalize and making of it a kind of both aesthetical, logical, etc. concept to understand language, art, etc. So this is not at all a conclusion, just a provisional stop to open a different perspective. We are not doomed to apophantic, to the alternative between apophantic and non-apophantic. There is perhaps a third.
Just a comment to you, or something. To me, the process of learning is always a means without an end, because you never know what you can do after this learning process. You never know what you can do with this new learning, right? So for me, it seems that what it means to be free from the end is that we are not fixing a particular end that we start out to plan to do something, but that in the process of doing something, something new comes out and becomes a new end.
You have a very beautiful perception of education, but usually now what is prevailing today is exactly the contrary, because today education, especially in the European university, is meant you must learn something to a certain end, and then you have to work to this, and then you must learn this. But you are completely right. This we could employ this beautiful concept of study. What does it mean to study? Study must be conceived as having nothing to do, as you said, with no end. And that's why the condition of student was interesting, because the student, the moment of life, there is a very beautiful essay by them called The Life of the Student, in which he develops this idea that the moment of study in the life of a man is a very beautiful moment precisely because it is free from any relation to other goals, economical, families, etc. And then we have also, you know that in Hebrew, study, the Hebrew term for study is Talmud. And I don't know if you are familiar with the history of Judaism. So what happened in a certain moment of the history of Judaism was that, as you know, the temple was destroyed. Then for the second time was destroyed forever. It has never been built again till now. As you know. Then what happened in Judaism that what was in the beginning the function of the priest who was linked to the temple was slowly, progressively substituted by the Talmud. So the Torah was no more applied. So the Torah prescribed, so for instance, the sacrifice must have this form, so the priest was the one who knew the Torah and then made the right gesture, killed the animal in the right way, etc., etc. Now, the Torah was no more applied, but studied. And so we have this very beautiful figure in Judaism, which is the figure of the scholar, the pure scholar, the one who studies the Talmud. Talmud means studies. And so you study the law and you don't apply anymore. So you have this huge, the Talmud is also the title, as you know, of a huge collection of texts of interpretation that rabbis makes about the Torah. But the synagogue took the place of the temple, and in the rabbi became something was studying the law and no more applying it. This is very interesting character of Judaism. But what happened is when you study the law, the Torah, but you not apply it anymore, you just study, again you are giving back this, you are freeing this from an end, from relation to an end. I just study the Torah. And this became a new value. So it's very interesting conception of this study. Which you have no more to really make the sacrifice. Now you just study how they should be done. So that's perhaps it's one of the characters in Judaism that I like. It's a very interesting idea. We are no more applying the law; we are just studying it. And of course, there are some other tendencies in Judaism which go in the opposite direction. And this idea of the fundamental character of the study. This one thing that got lost in the university, I don't know in the United States, but in the European university, this importance of the study as such was lost. The study must be connected to precise end. And then some more studies,
lost it in the U.S. too.
Pardon?
So we've also lost it in the U.S.
Also.
Yeah.
Not everywhere.
In some part,
But precisely, the university in the beginning was precisely the contrary, you know. And in many countries, for instance, even when you have finished your study in university, if then you want to make a profession, you have to do a special other examination with the representative, for instance, to become a lawyer. In Italy, after you study law, but then if you want to make a profession, you have to do another examination with the orders of the lawyers, etc. Just to underline the fact that the study is separated from the profession. But now, on the contrary, there is no more study. It's just learning something, a tool for the instrumental conception of study.
Do you know also of Edward Said's speech representations of the intellectual? It's very nice because he advocates for reviving the term amateur as a way to using love to direct your studies, which connects back to Latin, because Judeo, I believe, means to be eager for. So it's a desire related to study rather than a kind of instrumentalization or authorization, but a kind of desire or love as the basis of a way to pursue knowledge.
This is the right way to consider. Otherwise, it's not really interesting. Yes.
I'm curious, and I don't know if we can do anything with this, but sort of this opposition between language and communication, and thinking of communication sort of as maybe like the mathematical properties of possibly getting a signifier from one place to another, and what sort of the zero degree of communication looks like, and perhaps maybe it's a way to think through technology that they haven't really gone too far down.
Yeah, what do you mean? What's the question?
I was just thinking of this, like, the difference between language and communication, and if, in a way, perhaps communication is the sort of way of transmitting information, is sort of maybe kind of on the ST side of our ontological division, was, I mean, I know we suggested that language was sort of between the two, but maybe since language is, like we were saying, founded on command, maybe it's more on the Esther side, whereas communication is sort of pure information transmission. And maybe that I kind of think of, it doesn't happen so much anymore, but you used to sometimes dial the wrong number and get a fax machine, and you just hear all these beeps, and perhaps that's kind of, you know, at least a metaphor for pure communication.
Communication that does not work.
Right, that doesn't work, but it's still, it's kind of, it makes you aware of the process because it's communication without any.
There is also, sorry, always I often mention, it was written by a friend of Benjamin, whose name was Zone Rated. This guy lived in Naples in the 20th century. And he observed the way in which the Neapolitan people used the technological apparatuses. And he noticed a strange thing, that they always used these technological apparatus in the moment in which they do not function properly. And so that so they insert something, they give something like that. And for instance, in some way, they even completely use a technological apparatus for completely different end. For instance, it shows that he saw in the street a man using the motor of its little scooter, not really scooter, a cycle with a little motor. So he was using this motor in order to make the cream. To beat the cream in order they became the chantilly. And he was astonished to see how he did it. And he said, this is a more intelligent, more proper way of using technology instead of using the technology only in the street. Man, here you see a way of opening technology to a different usage. While if you just you are under the commandment of the technological apparatus, you do this gesture and you think that you are commanding, but you are just applying the commandment that is inscribed in the apparatus.
This conception of the commandment, would it be fair to say some function in public and are obvious and transparent, and other ones function under the surface? And I'm giving an example like Foucault's lectures on biopolitics, where he's talking about the advance of neoliberalism as this slow, creeping conception, and not necessarily overt and obvious, but functions as a kind of commandment. Say.
What's the question?
The question is, do some of these work obviously and transparently in a public way, and other ones function under the surface, without necessarily a knowledge, a public knowledge of them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like that.
I would like to kind of disagree kindly with you about communication and language. Because I think there's a really interesting connection here, and I suspect there's something with commandment as well. But there's more at work in communication and common and community than I think we recognize. There's a form of communication that makes possible the common upon which community can be built. Then language doesn't necessarily do that. The communication in itself doesn't necessarily do that. And education doesn't necessarily do that either. But there's a way, in English, we're language for education, because there's there's educare and then there's educare. And one means to fill up a vessel, basically. The other one means to cultivate something up. And this kind of communication, I think, allows for much more the opportunity for a flourishing community in a way that language, understood strictly in the sense of just grammar, might not. But I also agree that communication without this sense of cultivation and reciprocity, to get back to this term earlier, it wouldn't be possible. I don't know how commandment and community and common and so on, they all seem to share this root.
First, what you said is true, because now when we say that according to Deleuze, or the language is not communicative, so then we are using communication in a peculiar way, referring to a theory that means that a language will transmit a certain content from man to another, so information. Of course, the term communication contains the common, which is on the contrary the most fundamental thing. And in some way, remember in Heraclitus, did you say in English Heraclitus? He says the logos is the koinos, is the common thing. Because then if you go back to when we saw to show language as such, why we can do this? Because this is the most common thing. So the community, of course, implies language, and not in the communicational meaning, but in this other sense, that the experience of logos is the most common thing to man. So, of course, communication can have a good meaning and bad meaning. No, as far as the commandment, no, commandment does not come from command. Commandment comes from the verb mandare, which means to send, to mandate. So the commandment is something that you are mandating, you are sending. And so when we go back to Heidegger's idea of the Schikungen, that the history of being is the history of the historical, you could say commandments in the sense of the verb mandare. Mandate exists. What does it mean to mandate?
Mandate, it's, I think, similar. It's like a synonym for command. It's a mandate or an edict.
Okay, so you see, so it comes, the idea is the idea of a mandate.
It brings us back, it brings us back to technology also, because Ducrot, in the book with Svetlana Todorov, the Dictionary on the Sciences of Language, is one of the few people to represent Jakobson, who in 1955 writes an essay on the 6 aspects of channels of communication, and the one aspect that was not taken up or analyzed or written about, and in fact is only mentioned by Ducrot, to his credit, this is the one place where it appears, is Jakobson's emphasis on the phatic channel. The phatic. The phatic channel is that axis of communication where there's a recursive reflection on the channel of communication itself. And so that is a question of technology, which is both addresses.
Usually the phatic has no content.
No content at all. No, it's only about the conduit itself, yes? So the reflection on the conduit itself takes the question of technology and puts it in terms of sort of making present or making visible. So it's not a matter of communication, but it sets itself into relationship with language in that way. So it brings us back to the question of technology. Not telling it. It's the other book. It was a compilation he made with Svetlana Todorov, the Dictionary of Language, but it's just a small treatment of Jakobson and the phatic channel, which is something that you should still catch because I think it's an